Welcome back to the Real News Network. We're talking about Leo Panich's article in the magazine FP, and the theme is all about, is Karl Marx relevant today? Leo is, hello Neil.
Hi, Paul.
Leo teaches political economy, political science at York University, and is the author of Renewing Socialism. So, we left off in the last segment with the idea that, certainly in the American psyche, but not only, Canadian and to some extent, lesser extent, but also in Europe, the idea of state planning, of socialization, of socialism, is all connected with the idea of denying individual rights. So what do you make of that?
Well, I think Marx is very, very relevant to this. I mean, Marx thinks that our ability to collectively plan how we use the resources of the planet, our labor skills, our technical skills, etc., our ability to collectively do that, lays the basis for the expression of our rich individuality. It's the narrowest of individuality that is expressed through market exchange, through us relating to one another, through I produce a commodity and you buy it, through exchange value rather than thinking about how do we produce what we need, use value. And he sees this democratization of the state, which is what his movements were all about. Winning the battle for democracy was what he called it in the Communist Manifesto, as allowing us to achieve a rich individuality.
Okay, now when people look at the 20th century and
they
look at
see
the models,
something very different.
That's not what they see.
That's not what they see, and Marx, I think, would not have been a promoter of those. That's one of the ironies of having the hammer and sickle as his eyebrows on that front cover.
As you can see, we have a potato for a nose, we have bread around as the outline of the face, and I guess one could debate what the bread means. We've been talking, what does that mean, stale bread, or does it mean all you get to eat is bread and potatoes? The eyes are sort of megaphones, and then you get this hammer and sickle here, which a hammer and sickle at least had nothing to do with Marx, but clearly the issues, if you get Marx, you get the Soviet Union.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that they did make use of Marx, and it is true that in the 20th century, every revolutionary movement couldn't avoid giving the influence of Marx's ideas. So in some sense calling itself Marxist. So even Stalin, all of that appalling anti-democratic planning, which Marx would have abhorred, of course dressed itself in Marxist clothing. And that's one of the problems that now exist. I think you're absolutely right to point to it. Moreover, I think you're right to point to it in the sense that this is not an easy thing to do. There is a grave danger that if one doesn't change states from being impositions on society into being expressions of society, and that means changing bureaucratic institutions which are deeply embedded not only in the old Soviet Union, but in the Defense Department, in welfare departments, in any state you would look to, you're not going to get that type of democratic planning. Planning is not going to be a collective expression of human beings interacting together. It's going to be an imposition. We need to be able to be honest about this. I'm convinced that what is on the agenda for the 21st century is the rise of socialist parties that will rid themselves of this Stalinist and, from the capitalist side, bureaucratic state legacy. That'll be their agenda. It is impossible to avoid the need for planning in the face of the crises that are around the planet today. And therefore, what is on the agenda is the big question of how do we evolve a socialism that changes states in such a way that we don't get that type of bureaucratic planning.
Now, you do see some examples, do you not, already in our current society? For example, you have publicly run, like public PBS stations, for example, where you have a certain amount of community control. You have public school systems, you have elected school boards who run their school boards. I mean, is what you're talking about, is that an embryo of?
Of course it's an embryo of it, and socialism in Marx's sense was about absorbing the virtues of liberalism, free speech, freedom of association, right? Democracy. It was not a matter of doing away with those. It was a matter of absorbing them. Now, if it's the case, and I think one also needs to be very sober about this, that you're going to have capitalists fighting tooth and nail against a project to evolve a democratic socialist type of planning system, then the tendency will be to, if you are successful in making change, to deal with that enormous opposition in an authoritarian way. And in that sense, one has to say it isn't only a matter of what socialists do and what mistakes they made. One needs to remember it's also about the hostility.
Well, one can see that even with the kind of planning that, to the extent it's planning that Obama's trying to do, the opposition he's getting from the hard right within the Republican Party and the Democratic Party.
Absolutely, but it's redounding very much to the favor of those of us who are socialists that he's being called a socialist. So when Americans today are asked whether they prefer socialism or capitalism, they say socialism. And the reason they say socialism is not because they know. No, the majority there was 53% that didn't choose capitalism, didn't choose the market, and I think that's largely because, well, you know, if Obama's being called a socialist, then I'm not so frightened of the word, and it's not working. In other words, no, Obama's not a socialist.
Now, what do you say to people, both in terms of climate change and the urgency of the crisis, that it is necessary to formulate some policy now that, whether a movement would implement it or not, that needs to be implemented urgently? So there needs to be some rational policy proposed. You can't like wait for the movement and then have some policy.
Yes, I think you can only win people to a long-term project of transformation if you're able to offer them immediate reforms of a kind, however, that build on to more structural reforms. If you're winning a reform of a kind that's designed to close off social change, close off mobilization, as I think many of the social democratic reforms of the post-war period did, then they are the kinds of reforms one doesn't want. Now, yes, of course we ought to be insisting on new regulations that would impose limits on emissions, and rather than a cap and trade system. Yes, one should do that. One should be arguing for immediately it being illegal to simply close down a plant without some sort of a plan worked out with the community, with the local government, with the state government, etc., for how to convert the resources and the skills in that factory into something that is productive of use values, right? And to find the means of funding that. Those are short-term demands that are very important, and we need to be making them. And I think they do give people the kinds of confidence to go on to see that the bigger things are needed in order for those things to be viable and to be held on to. It's true, the bigger change is something that takes decades to build. This is not something that is on the agenda. The forces aren't there, the political organizations aren't there, the cultural support is not there. The role the media would have to play in making this viable is not there. So, you know, those people who say the climate crisis is such that we've only got 10 years left, when I hear that, you know, I think they are engaged in the type of scaremongering which is actually harmful rather than helpful. There's no reason that we shouldn't be pointing to the seriousness of it, but to say humanity has 10 years left. If humanity has 10 years left...
No, that's not, their argument's not that humanity has 10 years left. And they're also pulling back. They don't even think it's 10 years. It's how big is the window before global warming hits 2 degrees from post-industrial development, and here's the repercussions you get, especially in the South. Yeah. When you hit 2 degrees, it's a window. It's a window before the worst repercussions. Before
Bangladesh is flooded. Yeah, yes,
it's that.
But a lot of the rhetoric is not cast that way.
Yeah,
and it's much more generally put, I think.
Okay.
It's not a bad thing to get people to think in a longer-term perspective. You know, in the midst of a crisis. It's not, you know, during the Depression, a lot of people became revolutionaries, communists.
Well, the whole issue of longer term is actually goes looking at things longer term, that there's not just a 10-year window is really what the Real News Network project's actually all about. Because we know it's going to take 10, 15, or 20 years to get to something that can compete at the level of a CNN or a Fox or a MSNBC. So If you want something in a media project that can take on these kinds of issues, then, as you know, the donate button's up there. Thanks for joining us on the Real News Network.
Donate today and receive a new documentary film available to members of the Real News Network. The History of the National Security State with legendary author Gore Vidal. Bonus features of the DVD include an in-depth response to Vidal from ex-CIA analyst Ray McGovern, who served under 7 U.S. presidents, an exclusive interview with Colin Powell's former Chief of Staff Larry Wilkerson, and an insightful interview with oil policy analyst Antonia Juhas.
The news magazine of the screen. Living glimpses of history in the making.
Hollywood and Washington, there's a symbiotic relationship. They both deal with illusions. Reality doesn't often play much of a part. I think I saw through the myth of the Cold War almost from the beginning. I was a Washington political kid from a political family. Roosevelt first had radio because he had this great speaking voice and everyone liked to hear. Truman proceeded to break every arrangement that Roosevelt had set up for a peaceful coexistence. And Truman thought that it would be a good idea. Why not just stay armed all the time? And then he devised the national security state. You've got to go up and swear allegiance to the United States or else you're a commie. I mean, we had imported fascism. We get Dwight Eisenhower, who said that we have this great military industrial complex. It is a dangerous thing. And he said this is going to change everything. And the way our country's governed is going to change us politically. Along comes Jack Kennedy, who wanted to make his mark, believed in the Cold War. But he said in this kind of politics, it is the appearance of things that matters. I think everybody should take a sober look at the world about us. The national security state still exists, only it isn't communism anymore, it's terrorism. This is the most serious thing that has happened in the history of the United States. Knowledge is power. We need an honest news system.
We need the Real News.
This is the sort of thing we can build right now without anyone else's permission from the government or from the business community. It's the power's in our hands.
If we're not going to sleepwalk into more wars, we think we need to start with a television news network that won't bow to pressure and has the courage to seek facts. And that means independent economics. And that's why we need you.
Make a tax-deductible donation now of at least $10 a month or a one-time give of at least $75. As a thank you for your support, we will send you the new documentary film, The History of the National Security State.